Good morning, welcome to Connect Daily Bread, where we recognize man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. We're recording live here at RSU, so go ahead and read chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians on your own, but I'll just share a few thoughts from it. So Paul gets into, and remember in the letter to Corinth, he's responding to some questions that they had written to him. They had sent a letter to Paul asking about many different things, and in Paul's letter, while we don't have a record of their letter because it's not inspired by God, Paul references some of the things that they wrote in the letter. And so the context of Corinth was a incredibly promiscuous, immoral place filled with temples in which these false gods were worshipped through acts of sex. And so that's the context that Corinth is planted in. So they have some struggles in this area, as we've already seen and unpacked, particularly in 1 Corinthians 5. But they also have some questions about sex, marriage, singleness, and Paul begins to address that. So somewhere in the letter they had said, it's good for a man not to touch a woman, and obviously they mean intimately. And Paul kind of responds to that and says, oh, well, okay, yeah, that can be good. Particularly, not only good, that's beneficial and that's called for in the case of singleness. But singleness has its own struggles. In fact, he says it's not everybody that is called in such a way or that can fulfill that. There's some advantages to it that Paul lays out of single-mindedness and devotion to the Lord. And but there's also disadvantages, and there's a strong warning. It's better to marry than to burn with passion. And Paul was uniquely equipped to talk about this because he was married before he was a disciple. We don't know at what point that relationship ended or what the reason was, whether it was death or divorce, maybe separation because he became a disciple. But we can deduce that he was married because he was a part of the Sanhedrin. And the Jewish culture believed that if you were unmarried by the time you were 30, that you were acting in sin, and that would be a requirement for sure to be on the Sanhedrin. So he was married at some point, so he can speak from the perspective of being married and being unmarried that we see during his apostleship. And so he kind of answers their question and lays out the value and benefit of both of those. And so the primary takeaway is that whatever situation you're in when you're called, God will bless you right there. In campus, there's a desire to get married, which is a beautiful and an awesome thing. But sometimes I see a rush and an angst in that process where there's a fixation on that leads to discontentment. And rather than being content and joyous in the Lord while you have a natural and a good desire in marriage, which is something beautiful and amazing, particularly marriage in the kingdom. But in the midst of singleness, for those that are in that state, it's vitally important to allow God to fulfill you, to provide contentment, and to recognize that you got some advantages right now. You are uniquely equipped to serve in the kingdom in ways that are seasonal and that married folks do not. There's just a reality about an availability. Paul will talk about, a single-minded devotion to the Lord, having not become one with another, and naturally needing to love and fulfill what the Bible has to say about marriage. And so in the state of singleness, particularly for young people, particularly for college students, you are as available as you will ever be to fulfill the Great Commission of Christ, to make disciples. And so my encouragement is to make the most of that. Don't rush that process, but find contentment and joy in the Lord and make the most of that. For those aspiring to marriage or marriage, there's there are some struggles and disadvantages of marriage. Paul says, hey, those who get married will experience any hardships. And anybody honest who's been married for more than 2 days will tell you that's a reality. That marriage is, I often describe it this way to unmarried friends, is that marriage is simultaneously better than one can understand on the outside and simultaneously more difficult than one can understand on the outside. So both of those are going on. But whether married or unmarried, the focus is to be on Christ, to be about his mission, and to be about the expansion of his kingdom. And married people are uniquely equipped and positioned to paint a beautiful picture of the gospel. Ephesians 5 is oft quoted at wedding ceremonies, and it is about marriage, but it's deeper than that. So that passage in Ephesians chapter 5 actually says, at the end of it, as it lays out the submission and the love and the respect that married couples are to engage in, Paul closes that and says, this is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. And so really what marriage is a portrait of God's love for his church. And so fulfilling what the Bible has to say about submission, mutual submission, and love and respect and roles in marriage, God's able to put his beauty and glory on display. Because men and women created in God's image, uniquely, distinctly, but as if puzzle pieces to fit together. That's why it can be said it's not good for man to be alone, because there's something incomplete and lacking. And sometimes there can be a wonky teaching and a wonky view of females that just clearly doesn't come from the Bible. Right? It has to do with the idea of, being the helpmate or the helper. But first of all, we have to consider who's the one that needed help. Man needed help. And to recognize that word is only used a couple of times in the Bible. And outside of that we see of the word translated helper or helpmate, it's only used about God, actually. And it has to do with a life-saving, indispensable, irreplaceable role. So that's just an encouragement for a biblical view of differences in roles between male and females, different ways in which we bear the image of God, men bearing the image of God in strength, primarily. We know something's wrong with a man and that he's not living out God's design when he's only tender and never strong. Now, this doesn't mean that a man isn't to be a tender warrior. That's absolutely what is to be the case. But when there's only softness and no sturdiness, we know they're not living out the design. And then we see kind of the inverse of that with women, that when there is a sternness, a toughness, a hardness without tenderness, we know something's gone awry. And women are unique image bearers of God's compassion and his grace and his mercy. We see these realities in particularly in families, like when a kid scrapes their knee, they're running for mom, right? Running for mom rather than dad. So often is the case. And why is that? Well, it has to do with the image that God has in mind. And again, this is not to say that women are not to be strong and resilient and capable of those sorts of things. But men and women fit together to fulfill this in a unique and a special way. And so as Paul unpacks these things in 1 Corinthians 7, we see that he's really calling higher, which is important for us to understand that we have a purpose that is far greater than being married and having stable, successful, quote unquote, happy lives. But we are here. We are left on this planet to accomplish an eternal task and purpose, to fulfill the great commandment, to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, to love our neighbor as ourselves, loving other disciples even as Christ loves us, and to love and to reach a lost and a dying world. And that's just the reality of, man, why does God not beam us up to heaven when we come out of the water after a biblical commitment to him involving repentance and baptism? Why does he not beam us up to heaven right away? And the reason for that is because there's work to be done. And he doesn't just want us coming back home to him. He wants all of his kiddos coming back home to him. And so as we find ourselves here, awake, alive today, and in our bodies with an opportunity, we find ourselves with an opportunity to share the good news of Jesus. And so that's something to dial in and focus on during this prayer revolution, particularly, that we would get after it with an urgency and an intentionality on our campuses, making connections and relationships, making disciples, that we don't just go out and make friends, but we go out and make disciples. What do I mean by that? Well, if you make a disciple, you will certainly have a friend, and a lifelong friend, and an eternal friend. But you can settle for making friends without ever making a disciple, attempting to share Christ and the good news. And the reality is, when you have friends and family members and classmates and people in your life that you have not tried to get into a personal Bible study, you are telling by your actions, not your words, but your actions reflect what you really believe. And what you're saying is, to hell with you. And so this round of Prayer Revolution, this fall semester, is a time for each of us to own our purpose and our calling, to get after it, to fulfill what God has in store. There should be a time that each of us seeks to get into a Bible study. The goal and aim for the campus ministry is to have 20 Bible studies initiated this fall semester. That's doable, that's actionable, but it's going to take each and every one of us. And if we start to engage and apply with the kind of intentionality and intensity that we ought to, we're going to be able to see God do amazing things that we have longed for, talked about, dreamed about. We will see those dreams start to come to fruition. Most importantly, we'll see people that were destined for hell saved by Jesus Christ. We'll see lives that were broken and in tatters restored. We'll see cycles broken. We'll see redemption. And we'll see the mighty hand of God at work. So let's be bold. Let's be intentional. And let's get after it this fall semester. Love you guys.